It's a pleasure to be back in Kansas. I just wish it was real rather than metaphorical. Thank you, moderators, and thank you, everybody, for attending. I'm here to share what I think of as a report from the front about new ways of thinking about really two problems in human evolution. One is the one that is in this title here, the oddity about our species that on the one hand, as represented on the left of the screen, we're exceptionally cooperative and tolerant. Strangers can meet and have very pleasant interactions. And on the other hand, we have this tremendous capacity for violence. That's one kind of problem, the clash between those two things. And the other is about human evolution. How did we get here? How do we have a fine specimen of humanity, namely the president of Harvard on the right, emerging from a species that we might call Homo heidelbergensis on the left, represented, I don't know whether that's the president of Princeton or the president of Yale, but one way or another, we have this curious endpoint to human evolution that we're still trying to understand. How did we get to where we are today? The way I'm going to organize this is to first of all talk about the paradox itself. The paradox being that on the one hand, we are exceptionally violent, on the other hand, we're exceptionally cooperative. Then I'll talk about the two kinds of approach to understanding this, that we are very, I'm calling virtuous, very limited in our aggressiveness in some ways. How do we get that? And on the other hand, what is the role playing of violence in our human evolutionary past? And then we'll wrap that up and think about the evolution of Homo sapiens very briefly at the end. I want to point out that this is not a story about human evolution in general, because it really is a focus on males. So for the most woke among you, I apologize in advance for the fact that we will hardly mention females at all. This is a story about aggression, and the principal source of aggression in our species is, of course, males. And we see that in contemporary world. It continues to be a real bother to us, how on the one hand, mostly, we can organize our lives in ways that are very peaceful, but we can get these eruptions of violence that are so deeply disturbing, as in Kenosha here. So there's the paradox. On the one hand, exceptional non-violence, on the other hand, exceptional violence. Let's just look at these a little bit and see why it's a problem. The problem is that the ordinary way that we think about aggressiveness is on a single scale, that a species might be rather unaggressive, a species might be relatively aggressive, or somewhere on that scale from left to right. And if we have that single scale, we have the problem that on the one hand, we have apparently a tremendous tendency for reduced aggression compared to a lot of species. I'll go into this a little bit more in a minute. But this is the essential view represented by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The Rousseauian perspective is that we are born in a very unaggressive state, and that we tend to be corrupted by society if in fact we end up being more aggressive. And then on the other hand, there is the view that we have an evolved tendency for competition and violence and aggression, represented most commonly by Thomas Hobbes from the chaos of the English Civil War. In that case, you have the view that we are born in sin, as it were, and we are civilized by society. So those are the two views, and it's very difficult to see how we can be at both ends on the scale of aggression. But there is, in fact, a very simple solution that has amazingly taken a long time to emerge, and that is that there is not a single scale of aggression. There are two types of aggression, and they're represented here. There is the proactive and the reactive, the instrumental and the emotional. And these have been recognized for a long time in biology. They've been recognized for a long time in psychology, for decades. They're applied very usefully to children if you're thinking about problems in school. They're applied to criminal investigations. They're applied to psychiatry and psychotherapy. And we know a lot about them in terms of the way in which the brain controls aggression of these two types. And the two types are the proactive aggression, which is planned aggression. It's where somebody is not necessarily emotionally engaged, but they feel an aggressive plan that they design in order to achieve a specific kind of goal. And it may be to punish someone for wronging you. It may be to acquire something. It may be a moral wrong. You see it represented by various awful kinds of episode here, from lynching to genocide to killing a deserter. That's proactive aggression. It happens in animals. It happens in humans a lot. And then there's reactive aggression, which is where you lose your temper. There's a sudden initiation. A man comes back and finds his wife in bed with another man, and within seconds he pulls out his gun and kills maybe the man, maybe the woman. The aim is to get rid of this immediately provocative threat. And I've put in a picture on the bottom right of somebody putting their hand up as if to say, I don't want to get involved. And that's just to be a reminder that what we'll see is that reactive aggression occurs at a relatively low rate in humans. We have a low propensity for it. Well, back to proactive aggression. This is the type that clearly predominates in war, planned aggression, where one side plans to drop bombs, take out a machine gun nest, go on a raid into the neighboring territory. And that is where the source of most deaths come. In this figure, I've shown some of the data from various different kinds of society about the rate of death, the percent of population killed in war per year. And you see the four left-hand colors, the foragers, farmers, pastoralists, and industrialists, represent different societies. Each column is a different society. And you see a lot of range of variation in the rate of killing over the few decades that people were recording. But overall, it is quite high. And I'm going to show you what I mean by quite high in the next slide. But let me first draw your attention to the fact that the chimp range is in the similar range to the human ranges. Now let me show you what I mean by quite high. Look at these industrial societies. There are actually 5 there. One is so low you can't even see it represented, and the other 4 are lower than the foragers or the farmers or even the chimps in general. But the remarkable thing is that those include data for most of the 20th century for countries that went through both world wars. And it reflects the fact that even though we think of that as a particularly awful time, which of course it was in terms of the total number of people killed, in terms of the percentage of the population that was killed, it is actually not that high. The humans overall do have a very high rate of death from proactive aggression compared to any other species. And I think that comparison with what we clearly see as a high rate from the point of view of individual experience in the 2 world wars shows how high in general humans have been. And then there's reactive aggression. Well, here is a picture of some Ache hunter-gatherers, foragers in Paraguay, and they were studied by Kim Hill. And now it's 43 years that he has worked with them, and he's never observed them scuffling at all. Losing their temper to the point of getting physically engaged is a very rare thing in human society. And it's often something that will turn up in the news, of course, if people get into literally a physical fight. The situation is very different when it comes to chimpanzees. So what you see in this video is pretty intense aggression. It's the kind of thing that if it was seen in humans would probably get into the newspaper, but it's more of a daily occurrence in chimpanzees. And it just emphasizes a huge difference between ourselves and our close relatives. It's true for bonobos as well, by the way, that bonobos, the peaceful cousin of chimpanzees, has a rate of aggression still something between 100 and 1,000 times as frequent as humans when we're talking about reactive aggressiveness. So I think we can regard the paradox as solved. It's not paradoxical when you recognize that human aggressiveness comes in two forms. There's reactive aggression and there's proactive, and we have a low propensity for reactive aggression compared to our relatives, the chimpanzees and bonobos, whereas we have a high propensity for proactive aggression compared to most species, although chimpanzees also have a high propensity. Okay. Well, now what do we do with this solution? What I want to do is to investigate why it is that we have such a low propensity for reactive aggression, which is what I'm going to be calling virtue. And the key to the answer here, I think, is the concept of self-domestication. So our low propensity for reactive aggression, represented here by one of the most unaggressive animals I can imagine, the lop-eared rabbit, a domesticated rabbit, gives us the opportunity for individuals to interact together in a very calm way, to be very tolerant of each other, and to be cooperative, things which are really fundamental to the existence of Homo sapiens. And many people have regarded this kind of combination of characteristics as fascinatingly similar to domesticated animals. Basically, we're tame. We're tame in the same way that a dog is tame compared to a wolf. We have a low propensity for reactive aggression. The father of physical anthropology, as he is sometimes called, the German Johann Blumenbach, was the first to say explicitly that humans are far more domesticated than any other animal, but lots of people listed below have said this sort of thing in principle, that humans are like a domesticated animal. Now, interestingly, we can then move to thinking about the anatomy and whether or not human anatomy is similar to a domesticated animal. And the way to think about this is the way to how you identify the bones of a fossil or a domesticated animal if you are an archaeologist digging up bones in the last, say, 8 or 10,000 years. And the answer is that if you look bottom left here and think about the aurochs, which is the species of ungulate that gave rise to a cattle, you find a skull and you want to know, was it an aurochs or was it a domesticated one, a cow? And the answer is, look at these 4 characteristics listed above. Does it have a relatively light body? Is it got a short face and small teeth? Has the skull and skeleton been feminized, with the males looking more like the females now? And has there been a reduction in the size of the brain? And if those things are true, as you see in the picture on the right, then it'll be a domesticated species, as in the modern cow compared to the skull of the aurochs there. Well, what archaeologist Helen Leach did was to observe a few years ago that in their anatomy, humans are like domesticated animals, because when we look at the skeleton and skull of Homo sapiens compared to the ancestral species in the genus Homo, we see the same features. Humans have got, Homo sapiens have got a lighter body, shorter face, small teeth. The skull and skeleton have been feminized. And remarkably, in the last 30,000 years, we got a reduction in the size of the brain. Now, to put this in the sort of context of human evolution, here is a scheme to show the evolution of the genus Homo. So if you look at the bottom line, 2 million years ago, 2.0, you've got the emergence of Homo erectus, the first species of the genus Homo that could walk into a shop on Main Street and get clothes off the peg. It was the shape and size of modern humans, or in that variation, in that range of variation. And then you've got various species, and we'll focus on the ones on the right, Homo erectus becoming Homo heidelbergensis, and then about 300,000 years ago, you get the earliest species of Homo sapiens, the earliest members of the Homo sapiens species, identified by having a relatively short face, small molars, and a reduced brow ridge, which is a male feature that is now getting feminized. Here is that brow ridge. You see it as we move from left to right, from 300,000 years ago, maybe, dated on average at 315,000 years ago, this specimen from Morocco. And then you come to recent skull, and you see the brow ridge is largely gone. And the face has become narrower too. And this is fascinating because it's a phenomenon that is associated with reduced aggression. Men's facial width. The width of the face in relationship to the height from the eyebrows to the upper lip is correlated, it turns out, with aggression. And I put up a picture of hockey players here to illustrate this with a study of professional hockey players, as shown here, and in the same paper, a study of college hockey players, where you see exactly the same result as you see here. The result is based on the way that hockey players get punished for losing their temper. If they are too aggressive, then they are confined to the penalty box for a number of minutes by the referee. And the more aggressive, then the more time you spend in the penalty box. What you see here is the amount of time spent in the penalty box for 6 different teams in relationship to the width of the face, the relative width of the face. And some of these relationships are statistically significant on their own, and some are not. There's a lot of variation. You can't predict for any one man how much time he's going to spend in the penalty box based on his width of his face. But what you can say is that in general, the men with wider faces tend to spend more time in the penalty box. And this is just an illustration of the fact that there is this astonishingly persistent correlation with wider faced men tending to be found to be more aggressive. As I say, if you personally are wider faced, it doesn't mean that you personally are going to be more aggressive, but this is on average. So that's an example of a relationship between aggression and anatomy that is just very intriguing. Here overall are the human similarities to domesticated animals. We have a low frequency of reactive aggression. We have anatomical changes, in our case for 300,000 years, that have been similar to the changes that you see in domesticated animals. They are associated with reduced aggressiveness in animals and in humans, it seems. And then something I'll just very briefly talk about, we can now start seeing evidence that there are genetic associations with reduced aggression and the same anatomical changes. So here is an example of how we can get at some of these genetic changes. Domesticated animals have certain features that crop up repeatedly, not in every individual, but repeatedly. An example is the white toes and the white blaze that you get here in horses and dogs and cats and pigs. And this is rather the equivalent of the short face and small teeth and the reduced body size and the reduced brain size and the feminization that you get in domesticated animals compared to their wild ancestors. Well, this particular feature of the white toes and blaze is something that has given rise to an investigation of the genetics underlying domestication. Why is it that in these different lineages, you get similar kinds of features emerging in the domestication syndrome, whether it's outside or inside the body? And the answer that is suggested by some, including myself, is that there is a change in the genetics of a very early tissue that appears in the very early embryo, the neural crest. And it turns out that when you have a genetic change that leads to a reduced migration of neural crest cells from the back of the body outwards around the body, then the ordinary pattern of pigmentation doesn't work. So this figure that you see here imagines the way in which the neural crest tissue, shown in blue, comes out from behind the spinal cord and then spreads around the body. It's an absurd picture because it shows it in an adult animal. It should be in a tiny little thing, smaller than a pinhead, but it's illustrating the point that the neural crest carries or moves around the surface of the body, and it carries all sorts of implications for the emergence of adult organs. Well, one of the things it carries is the pigment cells. And if you get reduced neural crest cell migration, either reduced speed or reduced number of the neural crest cells, then the pigment cells arrive too late at their terminal sites. In other words, the end of the legs, the end of the tail, the end of the face, and you get a white patch there because there's no pigment. Well, that's the kind of thing which is beginning to show a tie between the genetics of the neural crest and some features in the domestication syndrome. And here is another one, a gene called BAZ1B. It's on chromosome 7. You can see its per location in the figure on the right. And in a very recent paper, this has been shown that when you have reduced expression of this gene, it leads to a delay in the movement of the neural crest. It occurs in domesticated animals, not in the wild. It occurs, or these new versions of the gene occur in Homo sapiens compared to our close relatives, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, whose genome is now being able to be looked at from fossil specimens. And in humans, there is a syndrome called the Williams-Buren syndrome, and they have this change in the expression of BAZ1B and is associated in their case with calm temperaments and reduced aggressiveness. So we're beginning to get a picture of a series of genetic changes that occur in domesticated animals compared to the wild animals, responsible for the tie between reduced aggressiveness and changes in the anatomy. The overall conclusion here is that we're dealing in Homo sapiens with a species that does not merely like a domesticated species in its behavior and like them in anatomy, but so like them with the genetics coming to support this, that we actually are a domesticated species. And that means we have to be a self-domesticated species because nobody else did it for us. So we see this increasingly domestic-like anatomy for 300,000 years, signaling reduced aggressiveness, ending up with our lop-eared rabbit behavior today. So there's the picture. The idea is that the earliest Homo sapiens, seen at 300,000 years ago, are just beginning to show the kind of anatomy that becomes exaggerated as we come forward in time to the present day. And this anatomy indicates that that was a time when reactive aggression started to be reduced, and we would call ourselves the beginning of a self-domesticated species. So the great question about that then is, why? How would this remarkable event have happened? And that's significant not only in making us less aggressive, but also in producing the species that we call Homo sapiens. So here we got a 300,000-year-old reconstruction of a 300,000-year-old male based on the Broken Hill skull from Zambia. And the question is, what changed to make them self-domesticated? To think about this, I want to go to talking about the pattern of dominance that emerges among males in ordinary primates. And the answer is very simple. In every group of chimpanzees, or bonobos, or baboons, or macaques, all of these group living primates, there is a single alpha male. And he becomes the alpha male by physically beating up all his rivals. He is helped sometimes by his rivals. He is helped sometimes by females. That happens in bonobos. And in bonobos, he is not necessarily dominant to all the females. He may be subordinate to some of the females. But in all of the primates, the alpha male is one who is individually able to beat up on his rivals. And I suspect that this would have been true for all of the species of Homo prior to Homo sapiens. At least we know that in Homo sapiens, it is not true. We don't have that alpha male system. Now, of course, we talk about alpha males in humans in a sort of joking way. But let's think about what actually happens with the dominance hierarchies of humans. On the one hand, you have small scale societies, the type that we all lived in, our ancestors all lived in until 10 or 15,000 years ago. And in those, the relationships among adult males are described as egalitarian on the basis of the fact that there is no physical alpha. There is no alpha, in other words, who can individually beat up on all of the other males. He might try occasionally, but he doesn't get anywhere. And then you have state societies. And here we again have hierarchies. Now we do have hierarchies in which you can clearly say that not everybody is equal. You have a president, you have a king, you have a prime minister, but those hierarchies are not the result of Boris Johnson or Donald Trump or Juan Carlos individually beating up on the individuals below him in the hierarchy. He achieves his status by being political, by using coalitions, and then things become very complex. But the important thing is that we have a different kind of system from the primates. Now, I said that every now and again in a small-scale society, you do get somebody who challenges the system. They're meant to be egalitarian, but sometimes you get somebody who just throws his weight around, who might grab some meat that comes in when somebody has been working all day out in the bush and finally comes struggling home with the results of their hunt, and then this guy takes it from them. Or who bullies his way into taking men's wives, or who just makes them feel bad, or who kills men who get in his way. This has happened. There are many ethnographic reports of them, but the same thing happens every time. You try, as a society, to deal with it reasonably. They cajole them. They ostracize them. They ridicule them. Who do you think you are, big boots? They might try walking away, just getting up in the middle of the night and leaving. But of course, that's no good because the kind of societies we're talking about, people are very good at following each other and they can just never really get away. So if there is somebody who is disturbing the social calm in a really serious way, making everyone else feel bad and maybe being life-threatening to them, then there is an answer, and it's always the same one, and that is the ultimate sanction is execution. Christopher Boehm is the anthropologist who has done most to pursue this line of reasoning and observation through the small-scale societies of the world. And here is what he concluded. He said, the typical domination episode involves a male who seriously intimidates people at the level of lethal threat and then is dispatched by his own kinsman with the approval of the group. And the reason for it being the own kinsman is because if someone who's not a kin is involved in the execution, then there's a danger that there will be revenge killings because the kin feel kind of obliged to support their dead relative. Now this pattern is understandable in a world in which you don't have police, you don't have an army, you don't have a state, you don't have anybody to call on except yourselves. And if somebody is using their physical strength, their weapons, their loud mouth to make life appalling for everybody else, then there is ultimately only one thing that you can do. And the idea is this, that the regular application of execution to deal with the original kinds of alpha males that would have been there physically bullying their way to the top, the chimpanzee-like males. Executing those individuals, now thinking about humans, would lead to selection against their genes. And their genes would be for reactive aggression. These were men who lost their temper when anybody challenged them. And this would lead to a domestication-like event. In 1932, worried about the oncoming threats in Europe, Einstein and Freud had a well-known correspondence. Einstein asked Freud, how can mankind prevent war? And Freud, in his answer, was the only person until very recently who suggested why it is that humans in general have evolved to be non-violent from a reactive point of view. The original state of things, he said, was domination by brute violence. And he was citing very new studies at that time of gorillas and baboons. And he was thinking of the way those males get to the top. And then he continued, the path that led from violence to right or law is that the superior strength of a single individual is rivaled by the union of several weak ones. That's what we're talking about. That's the way that an original alpha male in the very earliest stages of Homo sapiens could be defeated by a group of individually subordinate males, males who were scared of that alpha, didn't want to be beaten up by him, and they come together and talk about it and develop a plan to get rid of, execute that alpha male. And this is a unique feature in humans. And the thing that's unique about it is not that there is a coalition, because primates have coalitions. The thing that's unique about it is that the coalition is directed at a chosen target who is planned in advance. PACT, proactive aggression directed at a chosen target. When Caesar's assassins decided to kill Caesar, it took a lot to make sure that they were really agreed. And even when the event happened, they had to egg each other on. It takes a lot to have the courage for a group to kill an individually dominant individual. But humans can do it, and the reason that they can do it is because we have language. Sophisticated language, and it's got to be very sophisticated given the delicacy of the situation, enables us to float an idea with a colleague and say, you know, there's only one way to deal with this guy, and that is, let's get together and kill him. Chimpanzees can't do that. Chimpanzees can get together in small groups and kill members of neighboring groups, but then there's no decision about who to kill. Everyone knows it's the enemy. But in humans, they can decide that a member of their group is going to shift from ally to victim. And the important point about the fact that people can get together and plan the killing is that it means they can choose to organize the killing at a time when they have overwhelming power and the victim is totally undefended. Low cost, coordinated, lethal punishment, which still happens today when people are executed. So here you have, I think, the origin of social control by adult males, what Freud was referring to as right and law. And even nowadays, we have the same sort of thing occasionally happening. I don't know if any of you come across this. There's a remarkable case of a man called Ken McElroy, who bullied his way to the top of a village, or a town, a small town called Skidmore, about 400 people in Missouri. And eventually he was killed in front of a whole bunch of witnesses, and no one was ever brought to trial because there was coordinated agreement. We don't talk about this. He had bullied his way, he'd taken people's daughters as his wives, he'd burnt houses, he burnt barns, he killed pigs, he shot 2 people. He was an extraordinarily repentful man, And the village decided, the town decided that there was only one way to deal with him. And I think what they were doing was going back into our past, as it were, to do it. So what I've argued is that the way to think about the mixture of human goodness and badness is that our goodness comes from our having a very low propensity for reactive aggression. Our violence reflects the fact that we have a very high propensity to use proactive aggression in a coordinated way if we think it pays, which it does in war, and it does in the context of executing those who make our lives miserable. And of course, what you see here is our capacity for proactive aggression being responsible for our reduction in reactive aggression. So thinking about this in terms of human evolution, here I would characterize an old view of human evolution, which is to some extent still true. Here what we see plotted is a measure, a likely measure of intelligence, which is the cranial capacity, this how much room there is inside the skull, plotted against time, coming increasingly to the present. And we go back to the ape-like Australopithecines between 2 and 3 million years ago, and then we start getting into humans, and we see a rise in the size of the skull. And many people have thought that this is enough to explain the evolution and origin of Homo sapiens, that the result of increasing brain size was increasing intelligence. And as we did that, we were able to make better tools. We had more cultural and civilized ways of organizing our societies, summarized as more brains, less brawn. So the reduced robustness, physical robustness of Homo sapiens compared to earlier species was simply the result of we don't need it because we could think of other ways to dominate our landscape. We didn't need to just be physically strong. And there may be something in that. But what I've suggested is that there's something very special that happens when you get language. And I don't mean the origin of language, because probably Neanderthals had some language, probably Homo heidelbergensis had some language. But when language became sufficiently sophisticated that individuals could whisper to each other some very dangerous thoughts about, hey, what if we tried to use each other to kill that ghastly guy who's taken our wives and killed our friends? When it got to that point, something happened. We entered a new, unique world where humans, for the first time, could cooperate in ways to kill individuals that were individually physically dominant to them. And then you get a lot happening. And here I'm suggesting that once you have that cooperation based on language, you can have capital punishment. It will lead to a reduction in reactive aggression. It will lead to us becoming like domesticated animals. And one of the ways in which that happens is that we become better cooperators and we become more tolerant. And out of that, we get what we would call modern behavior, which I'm thinking of modern behavior here as the behavior of Homo sapiens a long time ago, 10,000, 20,000 years ago. Increasingly modern as we come towards the present. We have gone on to other things. Homo sapiens outcompeted all the other Homo erectus, Neanderthals, the Denisovans, all the other Homo have gone. We have diversified into a species that has colonized the whole planet. We even threaten to go into outer space. And that was all dependent, certainly, on our intelligence. But I think it also depended a lot on our ability to tame ourselves to the point where we didn't lose our temper so easily. We could cooperate and be a better kind of human. Thank you very much. And now we're going to transition to a panel.
Well, I'm Steve Kraske. I'm with KCUR Public Radio and University of Missouri, Kansas City. Let me introduce our panelists here tonight to be able to react to what Richard had to say to us today. On my far left, Christopher Beard is the Distinguished Foundation Professor in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department at the University of Kansas. Dr. Beard studies the origin and early evolutionary history of primates and other mammals. Chris, it's nice to have you here tonight.
Thank you.
Also with us, Jennifer Raff is an anthropological geneticist and an assistant professor in the anthropology department at KU. Her research centers around the understanding of human prehistory through analyzing the genomes of ancient and contemporary populations. Jennifer, it's nice to have you too. Well, Jennifer, I'll just begin with you. I don't know about you, but I'll never look at a wide-faced male again quite the same way as I have in the past. But what do you think of Richard's theory here, in which he attempts to explain how it's possible that men can be both virtuous and violent all wrapped up in one package?
So I think it's a really interesting theory. I think there's a lot to this that I find points of agreement with. I do differ slightly on some of the underlying science there, as one might expect. You can't get a group of scientists together and expect them to agree on everything. One of the things that I find a bit troubling is the association between morphological features and behavior. I find a lot of the studies that one looks at in the record, the scientific record, are fairly weak, actually, in their associations. And
the wide face, that kind of thing.
Well, yeah, I know, and we can chat about this a bit, some of the specific literature that you cite. But for example, there's one study where you look at UFC fighters, mixed martial artists, not you, but the authors, look at them. And it's actually a pretty terrible study, I've got to say. Speaking as somebody who's been immersed in the mixed martial arts world for quite a long time, there's a lot more complexity there that is not captured by comparing photographs of individuals' faces to their win-loss records. So in general, I find a lot of concern relying too heavily and too directly on the literature from evolutionary psychology, where a lot of the studies tend to be quite weak. They have small sample sizes and often overinterpret their results. But I do think that he qualifies his research quite well, and I appreciate, especially in discussions of genetics and talking about the warrior gene, for example, and how the effects of the warrior gene, as we see, are often overhyped, and in fact, it is extremely context dependent and extremely culturally dependent how that behavior is expressed.
Chris, would you react, please?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, it's a big challenge, especially when you look at the fossil record, to try to tease behavior out of the fossil record. That may be the most challenging thing that we face as paleontologists and paleoanthropologists. On the other hand, I mean, it's a basic guiding principle of evolutionary biology that one of the best ways to try to understand ancestral conditions is to look at the living descendants of a common ancestor and try to kind of, perhaps using just simply parsimony, try to tease back what that ancestor might have behaved like. Now, of course, that's a method that's fraught with all kinds of difficulties as well. If you have some fossils that can shed light on perhaps what that ancestral condition might have been like, then that can certainly help. But yeah, I guess my biggest question is, how confident can we be about the nature of the common ancestor between chimps and humans? That's a really interesting question.
Professor Wrangham, why don't you react to what both Chris and Jennifer are having to say here?
Okay, well, let's see. Jennifer was troubled by the putative association between morphology and behavior. And I certainly accept that one has to be very careful here. Had I had more time, I would have shown slides of the meta-analyses of the relationship between facial width and various kinds of aggressiveness. And that would take us into a discussion where I'm sure Jennifer would be persuaded. Well, I don't know if she'd be persuaded, but I accept that there are some weak studies, but and I accept the meta-analyses, which is analyses where people assemble the independent results from a whole series of different data sets. Even those can be wrong. But I think the thing that persuades me that there is something to the relationship between morphology and behavior is the result of experiments that I didn't have time to talk about today, where people take a wild animal and deliberately breed for reduced aggression, and then see that there are anatomical changes as a consequence. And this has been done with foxes, mink, rats, chickens, and mice. And you get these anatomical changes as a consequence of selecting against aggressiveness. So that seems to me to be very intriguing support for the kinds of correlations that I was talking about here. But I certainly accept Jennifer's point that you've got to be very careful. And the science, I think, will get better as we go forwards.
Professor Wrangham,
I think it's still very good with regard to the animal studies.
Professor Wrangham, those changes you just mentioned, are they detectable within one generation or two generations in what you're describing to us?
Yes, no, that's excellent. They're detectable over a longer period, by 10 generations, that sort of thing. But clearly, the longer you go on, then the more detectable they are. There are remarkable ones that are being found now with not with domesticated animals, with urban animals, where their reduced aggressiveness to humans, it would seem, has led to anatomical changes that mirror what you see in domesticated animals. That doesn't answer your question, but the important thing about your question is it's more than 10 generations.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to get some context here as we continue our conversation. I mean, Jennifer, it strikes me that Professor Wrangham is departing from some prominent thinking, Darwin being among them. Can you put his views in context for us? How original are they? How big a departure are they? And what he's saying, what do they represent?
Oh, I think that his views accurately represent a new way of thinking about human evolution that is fairly common among a subset of human evolutionary biologists. As far as the historical context, well, he does a very good job in his book of giving that context for us, in that there were differing perspectives among the early evolutionary biologists about the nature of man, because of course they all talked about man only, and his propensity to violence versus his propensity to more pro-social behavior. And I think that it is certainly only recently that this notion of self-domestication has really taken hold of a subset of evolutionary anthropologists and evolutionary biologists. I wouldn't say that it's probably the most predominant one yet, but it is certainly quite a strong cohort there.
Chris, what would you, how would you describe this?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with what Jennifer's saying. I think that, I mean, back in the day, several decades ago when I was in graduate school, nobody talked about humans being self-domesticated. So people interpreted the human fossil record more along the lines of that traditional, their brains are getting bigger through time, faces getting smaller, et cetera. I think that the distinction between reactive and proactive aggression that Professor Wrangham really makes a big point about, I think is a really important one, because clearly, I mean, he is a grade 8 behavioral ecologist. Clearly, the behavior of living chimpanzees, as we saw in the video clip, is radically different from the behavior of living humans. And the real question then is exactly how did those changes occur through evolution from a common ancestor that we shared, which really wasn't that long ago. Mm-hmm. Talking 7-8 million years ago that we had a common ancestor. So something really happened in between, and I think this is a really good framework to investigate.
Professor Wrangham, how surprised should we all be that we're still seeking to understand this most basic and such a provocative question that you're asking here of how human beings can be both aggressive and virtuous? Why are we still wrangling with this today?
Well, I mean, it's amazing because, you could have asked that question, or you could have asked the question, how amazing is it that we should be asking about what's responsible for the origin of Homo sapiens? And so what's amazing is that you have to step back a bit to realize how recently science has been addressing these very fundamental kinds of existential questions. The first 100 years after Darwin produced The Origin of Species and the first well-worked-out evolutionary theory were really spent not on thinking about applying them to humans, but on working out whether or not this was true, whether or not the theory was right. And of course, by the middle of last century, that was shown it was right. But still, the application to humans has been fairly slow to come after that. And part of the reason for that is that the fossil record is still developing. It's astonishing to realize that one of our closest relatives, the Denisovans, were only discovered, was it 2 decades ago or less? So it's a very ongoing field. It's not that major theories have been proposed and wiped away. It's more that we are, I would say, building on a sort of somewhat gently developing framework.
This idea, Jennifer, that
Chris think about that.
This idea that we're gradually eliminating from society proactive aggression through various forms of capital punishment. One thing I wondered is, are there enough cases of men particularly being eliminated through capital punishment to result in the broad sweeping behavioral changes that Professor Wrangham is talking about here?
Well, that's an area you can call me a skeptic in for sure.
Okay.
All respect to Professor Wrangham, but I think it boils down to humans are biocultural animals. We're not just biological animals. And I think that it's extremely important that we acknowledge the influence of both culture and biology in our behavior. And that is something that distinguishes us from chimpanzees, from bonobos quite a bit. In addition to the fact that we have been engaging on this evolutionary trajectory separate from both bonobos and chimpanzees, our own trajectory, it makes it concerning to me to draw simple parallels between them and us. Although certainly there are areas that we can look to them for in order to understand our own behavior, our own evolution, we have to be very careful about reductionism. And when it comes to genetics and driving human evolution and human behavioral evolution through selection, and this is a type of, I imagine, artificial selection, right? The removal of violent individuals by execution. There has to be, if it's selection, there has to be a genetic effect. And unfortunately, we do not understand the genetics underlying human behavior, underlying violence, as well as I think many people think we do. It's very enormously complex, and we need to be cautious in how we talk about this.
Chris, do you share Jennifer's caution here?
Honestly, I mean, my perspective is probably one of a broader perspective in terms of time and taxonomy. I'm not an anthropologist. I mean, what's interesting to me about human evolution, which is probably counterintuitive to most of the members of the audience, in Victorian England, people taunted Darwin and Huxley by talking about missing links. You know, there must be a missing link if humans have really evolved from an ape-like ancestor. Where's the missing link? Where's the missing link? Well, 20th century biological anthropology has provided us with a whole series of missing links on that human lineage from about 7 million years ago up until now. We've got a huge number of fossils now that illuminate that particular part of human evolution. It's a good thing we're not chimpanzees, because there are a huge number of missing links in the chimpanzee fossil record, and I mean, essentially the chimpanzee fossil record is nil. And that actually, I mean, it's hard maybe for us to think about this, but in many ways, additions to the chimpanzee fossil record would probably tell us a lot more about our own deep ancestry than yet another Australopithecine at this point. So that's one problem. Yes, there are missing links, but they're not where we think they are. I guess the question about modern human behavior and how is it different from modern chimpanzee behavior, is it relatively recent because of this self-domestication event in Homo sapiens, or is it something that has occurred in stepwise fashion across those 7 million years that we're talking about? To me, that's a bit of an open question, and maybe it's a mixture of both. I am intrigued by the fact that as far as we can tell, the earliest Australopithecine fossils that we know about already show a reduction in canine dimorphism. So males don't have these giant canines that chimpanzees still have. I don't know what that means, but it's classically been interpreted as some sort of reduction in at least intermale aggression in early Australopithecines. So it could be that we're looking at a long history that then gets punctuated with the evolution of language. I don't know. I mean, I'm just kind of riffing here, but that would be my idea, at least, or a hypothesis. I'd love to hear what Professor Wrangham
please weigh in here. What's your thinking?
Well, I totally agree that we have to be cautious about the behavior of Homo prior to Homo sapiens, and the self-domestication event that I think is identified by the changes in anatomy that occur at the origin of Homo sapiens could well have been preceded by other kinds of self-domestication happening, maybe with the origin of Homo out of Australopithecus, maybe with Australopithecus out of a chimpanzee-like ancestor. Those are difficult questions. There is one specific point, though, I would just sort of balance Chris's point about the reduced canines in Australopithecines with the male Australopithecus, I think it's fair to say most analyses now seem to have been substantially larger than females. And so I think, well, the interpretation I give in my book and fits with a number of people's is that the reduced canines are all to do with a change in diet, which means that the gape in the mouth was relatively little and they didn't fight so much with their teeth. And that change in diet would have been needing to chew much harder than happens in primates like chimpanzees, and the chewing would have been because they were eating roots in the more open savanna than the chimpanzees eat. That's an analysis that is supported by comparison with carnivores and ungulates, that species that have to chew more have mouths that open less and therefore less opportunity for the canines to get long and be used as weapons. So I suspect that there was still considerable aggressiveness in the male Australopithecus based on the apparent degree in body mass of the two sexes. And the robustness of the Homo prior to Homo sapiens sure makes it look as though they were pretty intimidating individuals. But it'd be great to know more about bone breakages and other indications of how often they were involved in episodes of aggression that would have left some kind of signal we can find in the fossil record.
You know, I'm just wondering, maybe as a final question, Professor Wrangham, this idea that it's such a profound idea that we are moving away from proactive aggression, which will be potentially great news to so many people if we can continue in this direction. what are the practical ramifications of what you're coming up with here? Can the process be speeded up? I mean, is there anything hopeful you can offer us that might lead us to a better tomorrow?
The kind of aggression that seems to be biologically reduced to judge from the changes in anatomy is reactive aggression, making us a species that is increasingly tolerant of each other from the point of view of immediate loss of temper, as it were. The proactive aggression, I wouldn't say there is any evidence of, well, there's no direct evidence for a reduction in a propensity for proactive aggression. You can certainly concoct a story that it might be being reduced because psychopaths are individuals who are given to proactive aggression more, as well as reactive aggression. And you can certainly make a story indicating that there's been selection against psychopathy, which might have been a feature more of our earlier ancestors. But the big picture about proactive aggression is that we are still a species very willing to use it, startlingly, scarily willing to use it. And I gave those examples of genocide and lynching and killing deserters, and you can find evidence of proactive aggression used to kill all over in every society. This is where Jennifer's point about the importance of culture really comes in, because the way in which species, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about humans or other animals, use proactive aggression is to make sure when they conduct it that they have very little chance of themselves being killed. The proactive aggression, the classic example in humans is the raid, which is carefully planned, leads to some deaths of victims, and then the aggressors scoot back to their own side. That kind of aggression has clearly led to a tremendous number of deaths over the human history. But as Steven Pinker, in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, pointed out, the actual rate of deaths has been declining really remarkably steadily. I mean, some variation certainly, but it has been declining over the last centuries and millennia, to judge from all the evidence. And the reason it's been declining is the cultural one, that we have developed institutions, we've developed social arrangements that make it difficult for the potential aggressors to envisage that they can get away with being aggressive. So I think the hopeful aspect is to say that we are on this path in which our institutions are better and better at enabling people to anticipate that if they use their power to be proactively aggressive, then there will be consequences. And the result of that is that people are less likely to be proactively aggressive. You can say that this is the fundamental logic underlying the fact that there has been peace among the most powerful nations in the world since the evolution of the nuclear bomb, because there is very likely to be a swift comeback to those who use it. It doesn't mean that we are not still living in tremendous danger, but it does mean that if we can develop consistently systems that mean that proactive aggressors are themselves very likely to suffer from launching attacks on their victims, then it's less likely that the attacks will be launched in the first place.
Chris, what's the hopeful takeaway for you from our presentation here today?
Yeah, the hope, I think, is that is pretty much as Professor Wrangham laid out, that humanity can rise above biology and overcome what probably was something approximating, you know, nature red in tooth and claw in the Pleistocene. I mean, you know, one of the things that's interesting to me is that there is this kind of duality between scientific data and analysis of that data. So for example, a number of decades ago, at kind of the dawn of genomics, there was a study that got promoted in the press as mitochondrial Eve. And the idea was that human evolution went through a genetic bottleneck in Africa, perhaps between 1 and 200,000 years ago, and that all living humans are descended from this mitochondrial Eve. So when the study came out, Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard said, oh, this is fantastic because this shows the inherent unity of all of humanity. We're all recent descendants of a common ancestor. Let's start singing Kumbaya. Another biological anthropologist, who I'm not going to name, at the same time said, we're all descended from a single common ancestor that recently. Tell me it's not true. This means that our direct ancestors were these demonic Amazon women that ran out of Africa and killed every single last one of the poor Neanderthals, and they were our direct ancestors. So this just shows that, you know, you can interpret scientific data almost however you want and kind of project it however you want. I think that that's a serious danger in studies of human evolution. But as everybody has pointed out, we are cultural animals. We can rise above our biology. I think that's the hope.
How about you, Jennifer?
I agree with what both of these gentlemen have said. I would also add to that we just need to cultivate among the public a healthy skepticism of simplistic answers to complex questions, especially as those that concern us. And make a plug for as both of you have also mentioned, the importance of our institutions in keeping our behavior regulated for the good of our species.
Well, Jennifer Raff, Chris Beard, both from KU, thank you so much for your time today. Professor Richard Wrangham, what a pleasure to have you with us. Thanks for taking the time from way beyond where we are. We sure appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you, Jennifer and Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
For more information about other Linda Hall programs, go to lindahall.org.